Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT Show. This is The Nation Talks, and we've been running the show for 190 separate broadcasts. Can you imagine that? 190. This is our 191st. And thank you to all of you for supporting us, and a particularly warm welcome to Douglas McGregor. And Douglas has signed up for the Indie Live YouTube channel, and he's a member. And for the sum of £202.99 a month, he gets all sorts of special privileges and offerings. So what to do if you're interested in supporting the work of this channel and many others, become a member. Become a YouTube member. It's easy, it's straightforward to do. You'll see the details on the screen at some stage during the show. I welcome each and every one, and I would strongly encourage you to sign up. So let's talk about another great day for British democracy. Yesterday, you may recall that Labour moved decisively to abstain on the Scottish budget. We also learned that the Labour Party would be happy to work with Farage. Farage Reform, in fact, is not a political party. As you know, it's a company, but it's an indication of how far right things have moved. I know many of you will be looking at what's happening in the States just now and be wondering how crazy things can be. Well, there's not much more crazy than a mainstream party saying they're happy to work with a far-right party. Sadly, we learned tonight that Kay Burley has stepped down as a broadcaster. We await other people stepping down whose records are a good deal less stainless than hers. On the positive front, it seems that Labour is inching slowly towards sanity on the EU, and that must be a good thing. Of course, you know, I don't make jokes about politicians and politics. I simply report what they do. That's almost a slightly paraphrased version of an extract from Rory Stewart's book, which was published a few months ago. I commend it to all of you if you want to know how things really work at Westminster, opposed to the version you see perhaps in the public prints. Enough of that. We have a great show for you tonight. I know I say that every week, but it's true every week. But tonight is especially good. We're going to welcome in a second John Proctor and Professor Dave Pearson, and they'll be talking about Energy Scotland. Why? Well, because there's few more important things in the world today than energy. Its generation, its use, either on the supply side or the demand side, and the whole business of the cost of energy, decarbonisation. These are all viable issues, which is really something we ought to be knowledgeable about. And we have the rare privilege and pleasure tonight to talk to two real experts. So without further ado, let me introduce John Proctor and Professor Dave Pearson. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hi, John. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. Good to welcome you both to the show. Dave, why don't you kick off and tell us why you think Energy Scotland is something that people should be interested in?
I think it's critical to a well-functioning society that we've got energy supplies that are robust, reliable, safe from foreign actors, not damaging to health, sensibly priced, creating prosperity through good employment. It just touches our lives in so many different ways that we have to have a functioning energy system, no different than we have to have a functioning supply of oxygen to breathe and food to eat and forms of happiness. So it's absolutely the lifeblood of a well-functioning society.
How can there be a well-functioning society when refineries like Grangemouth are being closed down? Where's the self-sufficiency in that?
Well, we're going to have to transition. I listened on the way back from Edinburgh today to one of the trade union members speaking about the failing there is the just transition things come and go. You know, we go back a couple of generations and our forefathers might well have been blacksmiths, and they were seeing the pressure from cars being driven. It's not that change is good or bad. It has to be orderly and well managed, and the next generation or phase of activity has to phase in. If we transition to a clean energy society, it will be a massive undertaking and create more jobs than will be under threat. And if we do that correctly, that's a good thing. It doesn't mean that it's not a transition, but it can be a net positive.
Do you think a lot of people might look at what's happening at Grangemouth and think that it isn't orderly or well managed?
I think they probably do, yeah, because if people walk out the factory gate and not having a job, that's not a transition, that's a termination. So clearly, if there isn't stuff to move to, then that's not a transition.
Well, I suppose they could always move to Belgium and join the refinery there, which the government is supporting.
I'm not a scholar of the oil and gas industry by any manner of means. Our other guest is, but transition to me means moving orderly from one paradigm to another, not having a gap in employment, gap in earnings, gap in social well-being. A transition means moving from one thing to another. I don't think the other is yet ready.
So it's hard to see how it can be a well-managed transition if one part of it isn't ready when the other bit is closed down.
I agree.
Yeah, it's problematic. And I'm not suggesting anyway I'm taking this lightly. I'm just simply saying, and because many people maybe watching tonight would be saying, well, my father, my son, my uncle, etc., just lost their job.
Yeah.
And I gather X thousand jobs have gone, but replaced by 20 or maybe 50.
And it will ripple beyond the factory gate in terms of impact. Our business is involved in various process activity at Grangemouth. They won't be counted in those jobs. I'm not saying they're necessarily under threat, but it's every job within the core business probably has 10 beyond it.
I'm still confused. Maybe you can help me here, Dave. I'm still confused as to why it had to close so peremptorily. I mean, why was it necessary to do it overnight, as it were? What was the problem with Grangemouth?
Again, I'm not a scholar of what's happening at Grangemouth. It's been talked about being under threat for quite some time. It's a privately owned business. They've made a commercial decision that they choose not to keep it running in the format that it's running. I personally would like to see it, as the commentator on the radio tonight was saying, transition into some of the new fuels, aviation fuel, for example. That's a huge undertaking and not one that you can switch on overnight. So transition has to really start from several years before the point of the baton change. It's like a relay race. The next runner starts running before the previous one hands the baton to them. Yeah.
I think a lot of people would say, makes so much sense what you've just said, Dave. John, what do you think of the closure of Grangemouth and the way it's been handled?
That's a good question. I first of all, correct, I'm not an oil and gas guy. I would never profess to be that. That's a certain degree of skill that I don't have. I come from a generation background. Forgive me, my throat's a bit hoarse. But I live in the Falkirk area. It's very important. If I'm speaking on behalf of myself now, not as Energy Scotland, I think I'm disappointed by the lack of cohesiveness of the campaign. The campaign to save Grangemouth has never really got any traction as far as I can see. I don't even know what their specific objective is. Is it to save a refinery? Is it to save the facility? Is it to transition? There's no clarity on that. And so we've not managed to coalesce the forces the way we may have done back in the day, unsuccessfully, sadly, around saving the steel industry. But we all knew what they were trying to do back then. I'm not convinced that we've got a really good campaign on that one. I could go on at length, but I think we're showing the breadth of the energy topic. As I say, I'm certainly not an expert.
But I'm still slightly confused. Taking up Dave's point, right? This is a commercial decision. In what way or form should government be involved in any way a commercial decision? I mean, the people who own the business decided it wasn't viable. What's the government's role in this? I mean, it's a commercial decision, a business decision.
Well, if you look in most industries, sooner or later, government's hand is involved, either lightly or heavily. And I don't think for such an important industry, for a country like Scotland, which is still producing oil and gas, to have no refinery capability is, well, I think it's rehearsed. We all recognise that it's not right, not proper. And so at some point in time, a government should get involved there. But exactly as I said previously, the nature of that campaign, it's not clear to me. I'd happily get my shoulders behind the wheel if I knew exactly where they're trying to go with that.
But why should it be down to campaigns? I mean, either politicians decide this is something they're going to support or they don't. If they don't, they're representing the public. The public has decided not to support it. What's the problem? You've got a situation here where the commercial interests lie in closing it and the government's interest is somewhere amorphous. So what's
again,
new?
Speaking on behalf of myself, John, I don't think it's accurate to say the public don't support the continuation of Grangemouth. I think the public, in this area, present company accepted, perhaps, they voted for a Labour candidate. And we, again, this is me speaking on behalf of myself, not Energy Scotland, because we're not ostensibly a political organisation. We saw the MP for Grangemouth standing up and being ignored in the House of Commons. So I do think government has a role to play here. Depending on the weight of that, we can get into a longer discussion. But I think also, by the same token, we need to have a far stronger, more effective campaign. But we're getting into Grangemouth, a very, very important topic.
Yeah. Well, let me turn to something else now. I want to just get your views on how you feel things are working out as far as, the new president has made some big changes. And one of the things he's decided to do is he's developing a new relationship with Canada. And I gather the Canadians are saying, well, we're not going to do this, we're not going to do that in retaliation. But somebody pointed out that the only refinery for Canadian products, because there's lots of sand in the product out of Alberta and elsewhere in Western Canada, is in the United States. So in other words, it looks like they're having a repeat of Grangemouth, except that the refinery has already been moved. But looking at the whole situation as far as Donald Trump is concerned, what impact do you think that will have? Dave, can I ask you first of all on the energy arrangements in Europe and, for that matter, in the UK in particular? Will there be any impact?
I don't know, John. It's not an area I'm schooled in, so I can't comment.
John?
Okay, again, this is me speaking on behalf of myself rather than Energy Scotland, but I think there's what I'm already picking up is a sense of people losing so much favour of the decarbonisation agenda. I'm picking up with people saying, do you know what? What's the point of us trying if Trump's going to drill, baby, drill? I think the best thing I could say about Trump is you've really got to separate some of his rhetoric from what he actually does. If you studied his first presidency, a lot of things he trumpeted, forgive the slight pun, and what he actually did were two different things. My fear is this time he comes, he's actually going to deliver some of the things that he's been talking about. So he's certainly, the latest, the stuff overnight is just terrifying. But again, I think about it. I woke up this morning and I thought, is that just him going off script again? I think even Netanyahu was surprised with some of the things he's saying. So we need to let the ball bounce a little bit on this one, I think, with Trump.
If that's true, I mean, who's writing the script?
I think he's channeling something from somewhere else. Who knows? But I think he again, if you study the man, he tends to go off script regularly. He has. Again, who was the last person speaking to him is a key thing. The trouble is the people, he's now surrounded by like-minded people, which is again a little bit different from his first term. But it's certainly concerning because he's. I imagine some of his advisors behind the scenes were pulling their hair out.
Well, isn't that the case of all politicians? They like to be surrounded by like-minded people. In fact, in the UK, what happens when a politician takes office at a more senior role, and this applies right across the board, they like to have their personal advisors to hand. They don't like the civil servants being too closely involved. Certainly, if Rory Stewart is any guide, he didn't find the civil servants very helpful at all. But they all have their personal advisors to hand. It doesn't sound like anything unusual to me. But can we move on?
Just on that point, I found in most best organisations, the strongest leaders have people who are not just giving them what they want to hear, right? They benefit from having people around them who are contrary. And that's probably a good segue into Energy Scotland, because we have a wide variety of voices within that.
I'm pleased to hear that. I'm pleased to. I'll tell you, every single bad decision that I was prevented from making was because somebody whispered in my ear and said, I really liked what you were saying, but it's a load of crap. To which I went off and thought, hold on a second, there could be some justice in that statement. They didn't put it quite as kindly as that, I have to say, on some occasions, but I encouraged it because it did save me a lot of bother and a whole bunch of money, I have to say. Dave, can you tell us a little bit about some of the really innovative concepts in, say, areas like energy innovation, like district heating, for example? I mean, what is the future in that sort of concept?
I think the future is really big. So whether you are a believer in climate change or not, we have over the last several decades followed a path of consumption of fossil fuel, and that has driven up. It's the single largest contributor to the rise in carbon dioxide levels around the world. They're now up at 400 parts per million. When I was born, early 70s, it was around about 320, I think, and it goes away down to 200 parts per million up until about 1850, and then mass industrialization has created an increase. I think we wrongly describe that as global warming. I think it's much broader than that. Parts will get colder, parts will get drier, parts will get wetter. Everywhere will just be a lot more chaotic. We get scenes of that all around. So what I'm personally aligning myself to is trying to find ways where people can still have the benefits that we've enjoyed from a very, very successful oil and gas nation, one of the most successful in the world. I want to find a new way of retaining the value of that, but by a different technique. And for me, the most effective way of doing that is by harnessing wind-generated electricity into heat pumps. And in some businesses and cases, that will be individual heat pumps for a smaller building. But for the high-density areas of cities, let's take my hometown of Glasgow, the city centre of Glasgow won't be able to be heated by individual heat pumps on each building. It will need to be a network of hot pipes under the streets. And those hot pipes, the heat will be generated from larger heat pumps in a central location or maybe a couple of locations. And they will be providing the hot water that gets pumped around the pipes that then serves the buildings with the energy that they require for both space heating, but also domestic hot water. And if we follow that route, and we've done a project down at Clydebank at Queen's Quay, I checked the carbon footprint of that facility today, and it's over 95% reduction in the carbon footprint of burning gas in gas boilers.
And tell us a little bit more about that project.
So West Dunbartonshire Council own a facility on Queen's Quay, which is where Queen's plural rather than possessive, Queen Mary, QE1 and QE2 were built, the John Brown shipyard. Sadly, no longer there. That's another tale of deindustrialization for another episode, perhaps. But On that site, Western Bartonshire have created an energy centre, and we are delivering hot water to a new heat network that serves many of the buildings around that area, not as many as I'd like, but the source of the heat is the Clyde estuary. So we're taking water out the River Clyde, cooling it down in a large refrigeration system, and harnessing the waste heat that gets sent forwards to the heat network. And
so
therefore,
let me just make sure I understand this, Dave. So you take water from the Clyde,
yes,
and that water is at a particular temperature, which enables you to extract heat.
Yes.
A lot of people watching will be thinking, I know the Clyde, it's cold at this time of the year.
Yes.
Help us understand that, Dave.
It ranges from about 4 degrees to 20 degrees from a wintry day to a warm summer's day at that particular part of the Clyde. Refrigeration is all about cooling something down. You can't destroy the energy. You can just move it from one place to the other. Unlike the refrigerator in your house where the inside is cold, but the back of the refrigerator, a bit harder to see now that most folk have a built-in refrigerator, but that black serpentine coil that you see on the back that would feel warm, that's the heat being pushed out of the device. If you take that on a much, much larger scale, and this heat pump, to put it in context, is probably about the size of half a tennis court, hidden inside the energy centre. But what we're doing is we're cooling down river water by pulling heat out of it. Because there is no such thing as cooling, there's only less warmth. So we're pulling the heat out of the river water. That goes through the refrigeration system and pops out at a higher temperature, around about 80 degrees. And that 80 degrees is being used to heat a loop of water that is pumped around the various buildings. So town hall, library, swimming pool, business centre, and so on. Some new flats that have been built for the housing association. And that 80-degree water is then connected to each of these buildings and each of these apartments. So instead of having a gas boiler in each of these buildings, they have a supply of hot water. And that hot water is used to heat the buildings, but also to provide any washing water. Domestic hot water would be the technical term.
So the Clyde water comes in at 4 degrees, but the output is 80 degrees.
Yes.
Sorry, just help me a little bit to understand this. So it's the cooling nature of the process that generates that temperature gap, that gradient.
We use temperature is all relative. We can go all the way back to Lord Kelvin in 1852, who first espoused this as a theory. But we see that the river water is warmer than the working fluid inside our large refrigerator. So the heat jumps from the river water into the working fluid. That causes the working fluid to boil, because all fluids boil at different pressures and temperatures depending what they are. Water, very commonly known at atmospheric pressure, boils at 100 degrees. But if it was above atmospheric pressure, it would boil at a different temperature, above 100 degrees.
Okay.
So that energy is
by altering the pressure.
It's not water inside the refrigeration cycle. It's a natural working fluid called ammonia, and that energy jumps into the ammonia loop. But when you create a vapor and then try and compress it, it rises in temperature. That's thermodynamics.
Got it.
And so we raise the temperature of the ammonia from about 2 degrees to about between 80 and 100 degrees. That's warmer than the water loop that's going around the district heating, to two totally separate loops of water. One's the river, and one's a closed loop of water for the buildings. And so we're pushing that energy forwards. We have to use electricity to drive the compressor, but this is the beauty of it. For every unit of electricity that we consume, we get 3 units of heat delivered. Right. And that's the magic of it. We don't make it out of fresh air, though. That balance of 2 units of heat came out the river. So we're cooling the river slightly to deliver heat to the buildings.
Excellent.
And
so
that's
how many buildings are you presently heating on this basis?
There's about 7 or 8 large buildings, and I think that's the key thing, is that these are very large buildings, swimming pool, for example, or the town hall. It would be really quite difficult to do these with individual heat pumps. So a centralized heat pump, and it keeps all the the engineering challenge in one place as
Now,
well.
I'm going to ask you the inevitable question, which a lay person is bound to ask you, which is, how easy or difficult would it be to scale this up?
Oh, the one that we've done in Clydebank is a third of the size of the one we did in Drammen in Norway. It featured in one of Leslie Riddoch's movies a couple of years ago. It in itself is a fraction of the size of some of the largest heat pumps in the world. There really isn't a limit if you've got enough space, enough stuff you can cool down. In the case of the Clyde estuary is probably 1,000 or many times more than the quantity we're doing at the moment, and then the supply of electricity to drive it. That's the recipe, if you like.
But if you're generating, let's say, the electricity from wind power, now granted the wind isn't always there, but in Scotland it's there for a lot of the time compared to other countries, then you're getting almost free energy coming in. Of course, you've got the installation costs of the wind installation, granted, but nonetheless, on the face of it, it looks once you've spent the money on installing the wind farm, then you've got that electricity to use, I suppose, in order to effect this transfer.
You're entirely right, and the majority of the operational cost of the facility is the electricity that's purchased to do it, but we're buying a third as much electricity we would need to if we're doing electric heating.
Yeah. Oh, it sounds very exciting. And is this documented in Energy Scotland's website? Is this information available?
We've got a link to that, to the work that the Star Refrigeration are doing. So there is a linkage to that. And one of the photographs you saw coming up a second ago showed you the installation at Clydebank, which is, I've been there a couple of weeks ago, and it's impressive.
It sounds impressive. I mean, it sounds very impressive.
Keep in mind as well, we're talking also that there are many people who are putting domestic heat pumps in. So they're the small end of the scale, very small. Yeah. So that industry is definitely breaking through. But
I have friends in Dunfermline who installed a heat pump. They were very happy with it, and then along came these gales and wiped out their electricity supply, which meant that I think they lost the heating as well.
I hate to be the purveyor of truth, but I don't think many gas boilers work without electricity either. So.
This is absolutely true, Dave. So now,
I think the important thing to say is Energy Scotland is not a heat pump group. It's a conglomerate of a variety of different perspectives. They don't all agree, but different aspects of the energy conundrum coming together to try and crystallize a common view.
Sounds great. Now, John, I gather you've got Energy Scotland has a conference coming up on the 1st of March. Tell us what that's about, who's going to be there, what you'll be discussing.
So maybe before, I'll just give you a little back just to cover what you're talking about before.
Please.
Energy Scotland is an association of energy professionals, people who are involved in innovation, people who are involved in generation, people involved in asset management, and covering. We spent a bit of time here on district heat, on heat pumps, but the guys are very, very passionate about hydrogen. People who are convinced of different solutions. So we can talk a little bit about that. But what we're trying to do is bring together a view that is benefiting Scotland, is serving the decarbonisation agenda, and is also thinking about fuel affordability, which is very important. So that they tend to be called the trilemma: security of supply, fuel affordability, and decarbonisation. And we put what we call the fourth leg of the stool in, which is focusing on Scotland's industry, Scotland's economy. So that's what Energy Scotland's about as a group. We came together. We mentioned Leslie Riddoch, that actually the genesis of the project was me contacting Leslie and saying, that she's a force of nature, as anyone who's encountered her will know. And I was saying that really there has to be a better conversation on energy in Scotland because of the importance of it to our economy. And if you roll the clock back 18 months, believe it or not, it wasn't really that prominent in the news at that stage. roll the clock forward 18 months every day. There's 3 or 4 articles on the subject, which is great. But as I reached out to Leslie and suggested, it might be helpful if we can bring together 1 or 2 people that she has clearly in contact with. Professor Pearson was one of them. She was talking about the work he's been doing for a number of years. We also encountered other guys who are developing technology. I mean, you may have encountered Simon Forrest, who's bringing forward tidal energy solutions, real innovators within Scotland, and various other guys who are more involved in the generation and asset management side. So we've got a real range of people here. And what we're trying to do is create a safe place for people to exchange their views. There are a whole raft of things that we could maybe nuances we could take issue with, but we are all committed to try and advancing Scotland's future, right? And that's the segue into that is the convention that's taking place on the 1st of March. Again, via Simon Forrest. I got introduced to a guy called Ian Grant and John Brown also, who are pulling together the IFS, which is Institute for Scotland, and they have a convention which was originally scheduled for the 30th of November, St Andrew's Day. Unfortunately, because Alex Salmon's untimely demise, his memorial was that day, so it was pushed off to the 1st of March. So we've been asked, Energy Scotland's been asked to convene the session on Scotland's energy future, which we will be doing. There's a few other things taking place on that day. I think they're talking about the democratic channels for Scotland to express itself in whichever way, and that'll be clearly an interesting discussion. And I think there's another discussion on land, which land reform is a key aspect of Scotland's future. So I think that's the first of the conventions, and the plan is to have another one maybe every 3 months with new topics coming forward. But we were glad to be invited to speak about energy.
And on March the 1st, what in particular will Energy Scotland be discussing? What specifics?
So the format that we are coming forward with is we're looking at is what's called what I call World Cafe. Some people maybe worked in the World Cafe format before. It's a way of kind of involving people in discussion and bringing ideas out and try to solve problems. But we've only got an hour and a half. There's a lot of business trying to be covered on that day. So we're going to do World Cafe meets speed dating. And what will happen is we're going to have 4 different stations within the hall. The first one will talk about what are we facing at the moment in Scotland? What's the constraints of the current devolved settlement? What's stopping us, or what can't we do? The next station will talk about, okay, within that settlement, what can we do? And some of the things like Dave Pearson speaking about, and Simon, there's a lot of things we can do within that to push forward Scotland's energy future. There's an awful lot of things, and we'll come back to that. And then the third station is our vision. If we were unconstrained by any political constraints or constitutional constraints, what would we do with energy in Scotland? So that's the vision section. And then the fourth station will be, what's the action plan? Where do we go from the as is to where we want to be? So that's what we're going to do on that day. And what we'll have is we'll have people from Energy Scotland facilitating a short conversation, and then people can then move around the room to talk about each of the stations, and hopefully we can gather some good input. Because one of the things that I tend to say, there is no monopoly of wisdom. If you look at this discussion of energy, everyone understands energy at some level, whether you understand the thermodynamics like Professor Pearson, or whether you just understand how bloody expensive it is to switch your light on. But we all have a concept of it. But people have an awful lot more to say on this topic when you start to open it out. So I'm looking forward to a very open discussion, even though we've only got an hour and a half to try and bring it together.
I noticed that, well, first a quick question, Dave, for you, and then I'll come back to you in a second, John, if I may. We've had a question who's asking, listening to what you were saying earlier, Dave, about the Clyde estuary, the question is, could this process be operated in smaller rivers, such as the River Cart?
Yeah, to some extent, yes. I mean, so long as there's still water in the river at the point where you want to do it. The Cart has a colossal range of flow rates from winter to summer. We did look, obviously there's the white cart and the black cart, but we looked in great detail in Paisley a few years ago, You don't need a tremendously large flow of water in the river to get a fairly significant quantity of heat out. I think it is important to mention that if it was a pond, for example, with no water flow through it, you would effectively just continually cool the pond colder and colder. So long as there's a flow rate and so long as the water's above 4 degrees, there'll be a fairly significant quantity. So I would imagine the cart probably could support many tens of thousands of houses as a heat source.
And if we take it in the opposite direction, we talked earlier about scaling it up. How small could it be? I mean, for example, if I'm in the Highlands and I've got a little river running past my shieling, would it be practical for me to consider this?
Probably not if it's a small burn. Pumping water and the equipment to make sure the heat pump doesn't get choked up with debris that's going down the river has got a practical limit. We're doing a project in Govan at the moment for the old Govan church where the Govan stones are kept, and that's about 300 kilowatts. To put that in sensible numbers, that's probably the equivalent of about 60 houses. So you can do small heat pumps. The challenge is the infrastructure the right way to do it? Air source is a very valid way of doing small heat pumps, and equally through the door behind me, I've got a ground source heat pump. It's a vertical bore down into the ground. I don't live in a country estate with a couple of fields out the back with plastic pipes slinking about. So a vertical borehole. And somebody said to me, that's very expensive compared to an air source heat pump. And I said, well, the borehole cost me about £5 per week for the next 40 years. It's a cash flow thing rather than a cost thing.
When you talk about the borehole, are there subsidies for doing that?
Well, this is where we stroll towards policy. There were subsidies back when I did it, but it was the renewable heat incentive, more commonly associated with the biomass. And in Northern Ireland, cash for ash was the headlines. But that stopped in 2020. Yeah. And we were promised a follow-on. There were actually two types of renewable heat incentive. There's domestic and non-domestic. Queen's Quay took advantage of the non-domestic variant, and domestic houses took advantage of the domestic arrangement. The domestic arrangement was replaced with in England, it's called the boiler upgrade scheme. I forget the name in Scotland, but basically it's a capital grant upfront of about £7,500, £8,000. It's pretty generous, I have to say. Yeah. And that's what's used. Unfortunately, there's no follow-on in policy. It was promised in 2018, but there was no follow-on from the government in Westminster at the time to support large heat pumps. And that's why we've struggled. There hasn't been a single planning application in Scotland for something of the ilk of Queen's Quay since 2017. That's 7 or 8 years ago. So we went to all the bother of proving it, considerable expense by lots of different parties, proved it works, and now there's not been another one since. And that's entirely down to policy. It's not an engineering barrier.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting because that takes me neatly back to John now. One of the items that I saw listed on your agenda points for March the 1st is GB Energy. What's your take on GB Energy?
Okay, I'm going to offer this now again. This is a John Proctor view rather than an Energy Scotland view. But I wrote an article for the national newspaper back in November, and I did give them a bit of a hard time because I was saying, the song, when you see you got a football match and the referee's lost the plot, and you hear both sides of the ground saying you don't know what you're doing, you get the sense that they've lost the control. I actually looked at what Labour came forward with for during the election campaign. I was like, what is this? What is this thing going to be? How are they actually going to be able to deliver a £300 a year saving from the average bill. And I was like, we were asking questions. The questions weren't getting asked properly. I've got to say, the journalistic community did not cover themselves in glory. It was simple, what is this thing going to be? From what I could gather, and this turns out it's coming to pass, it's really going to be a development entity is going to try and bring forward projects, which in itself is an admirable goal, to bring forward, decarbonisation projects, district heating projects. If that's what it does, that's fine, and maybe help bring forward some of the projects Dave's working on. So that would be good. But that's not going to save £300 a year in the average bill, right? That, there's the fund have got 8.7 billion is never going to hit that. They are not going to move the market. So it was were the people who were talking about that, Anna Sarwar, etc., were they just not understand, or were they not being honest with people?
Hold on a second. Just tell us what GB Energy is. Well, what is it?
That's a great question, right? And it's gone through the House of Parliament, both houses, and I've been sort of trying to catch up on that. And there's a lot of things they will say what it is, but they're not prepared to actually put it into the bill itself. So they say it's going to be we're very in favour of community energy. Okay, well, you put some form of commitment into developing a level of community energy, and they seem so far to refuse to do that. Now, when that finally emerges, we'll wait and see. But at the moment, it's a company that reports to Ed Miliband. Right, so he has this almost full control of what that it will be. We have Jürgen Meyer, ex-head of Siemens in the UK, is now the CEO of that. He was on TV this week being interviewed, and I feel, to be candid, if you can feel sorry for a CEO of GB Energy, I felt a wee bit sorry for the guy, because at last someone was telling the truth about what GB Energy is going to be. It's not going to create 1,000 jobs in any time soon in Aberdeen. If it's a development entity, they are going to be just that, a development entity. They will bring forward projects, and at some point in time, they will help make things better in industry. But it's going to take many, many, many years.
Just a minute. All they've got to do is pick up the phone and call Professor Dave Pearson. Why do you need to have a GB Energy to do this?
I think that's a very good point. If they listen to Dave, I
just don't understand it. I mean, it's all there. I mean, Dave just pointed out it's a policy matter. It's not an engineering matter. So therefore, all they have to do is change the policy and connect to what he's doing. You don't. I genuinely
think they don't. I don't think they understood it. Right. I mean, if they cannot answer the question what they're going to be, are they going to be a developer? Or are they going to be an asset-backed trader? Or are they going to be a generator? Or are they going to be a supplier? These are all defined terms within the Energy Act, right? These are different players, different entities, right? Now again, this is Proctor's view, but the money, and this, from my experience as a generator, the money is in asset-backed trading. That's where the money is, and right, there's not an awful lot of money to be made in the supply. There's thin margins there, right? And what you really need to do is to get a regulator with some teeth who doesn't come from the industry, that are captured by the industry, and really go after some of the levels of profitability within that industry. If you look at how much money has been made by the power companies over the last couple of years, it's in the multiple, £15 billion across the big six. It's an awful lot. Now listen, these companies, I'm sure they've got a right to earn money, but the fact that their profit soared during the post-Ukraine period tells you there's questions that need to be answered there. And this is a Proctor view. Energy Scotland, we talk about this, and a lot of the people sort of concur with my view, but we're in the process of developing a paper to talk about how we progress the energy market reform that has not been taking place by GB Energy, because it wouldn't do. It's not geared to do that. Anyway, I'm going to give Mr. Pearson a chance.
Yes, of course.
I think I'll stick with some positives and then give some reality. If GB Energy shines a spotlight on some of the challenges for developing more energy projects, that's probably a good thing, because there are more barriers than a Rangers Celtic match. It's really quite dramatic how many barriers are put in place. So spotlighting them and taking them out the way to get these projects moving faster is probably a good thing. And that will create jobs, and that's a good thing. And the jobs will come not from who actually works for GB Energy, but who in the supply chain is involved in this. And that's, again, another episode of how do we create more jobs in the UK or Scotland side of that, rather than just buying bits of kit from abroad. Our heat pumps are made in Glasgow, incidentally, from girders. That could be a catchy slogan.
Yeah, why not?
However, what GB Energy is not is actually an energy-focused entity. It's an electricity-focused entity. And if you take a very Scottish perspective on that, we've already got as much electricity as we're currently using in Scotland from wind on a net basis. It averages, and sometimes there's imports. I get that before anybody jumps down my throat. But we're generating more net over a year. However, we're not generating more than we will need. So we do need more of it. But what concerns me about GB Energy is that it's taking that spotlight entirely onto the electricity projects. And I'm quite happy to have a thing called GB Electricity, but it concerns me to call it energy when actually there's other forms of energy. First of all, there's the phase down or transition of gas, and that has to be recognised. But would it surprise you if I said that 51% of Scotland's carbon footprint is now heating? 51%. Electricity and has driven down to practically zero. Everything else has stayed roughly the same. Transport's coming down a bit. Heat is getting left high and dry. And when, 90% of the population is in electric cars and there's a couple of other variants and all the rest of it, we'll still be saying, gosh, what about heating? And so we've gone from this position of a 3-0 lead of electricity generation in Scotland. And I will forever doff my cap to the folk that have done it. Sure, they've done it for individual commercial reasons, but we have achieved a dramatic rollout of wind generation. It's not without its challenges, but they achieved it. They said to the government, give us this and we'll give you that. It was basically a subsidy mechanism to make it work. However, the needle has not actually moved in heat. And if it's moved at all, it's because of the subsidies for biomass, which actually isn't a very sustainable practice at a large scale. So we won't get into the details, but Drax is importing wood chips from all around the world. That is not sustainable, nor is it the future. And when the subsidy's finished, they'll stop doing that because it won't be economically viable. And the folk in Yorkshire will be having their Grangemouth moment. So what we've got to focus on is the wider picture, and that's how do you do clean heat? And that's the bit that could be a massive investment piece. But I spoke to the Scottish National Investment Bank some 7 or 8 years ago, and they said, look, we really see that district heating is a place. We really want to invest in it. How do we invest in it? I said, you can't, because it's not economically viable. And they said, oh, why are you so passionate and enthused by it? I said, well, it could be economically viable if you had the right policies behind it. But we don't have the right policies because the spotlight was always on electricity, then a little bit towards heat, and then it swung firmly back towards electricity because England and Wales are trying to catch up with where Scotland got to. And we've created this GB emphasis on electricity generation, and it's giving away this pole position lead that Scotland had in terms of progressive energy. And
you said at one time that Scotland was 3-0 up. What's the score now?
Well, I think everybody's off getting a bovril and a pie, and they don't really know what the score is. So, we're and it's not a us versus them sort of thing. It's a greater perspective, but we're definitely giving up our lead. I know at least half a dozen businesses that would invest over £1 billion in the district heating network in Scotland.
Oh my!
But they can't, because it's not economically viable. And the reason it's not economically viable, and let's put some numbers on this because I'm more of a numbers guy and a words guy, but we make electricity in modern wind farms for about 7.5 pence per kilowatt hour at the top of the hill, as I call it, because that's a good place to put your wind farm. At the bottom of the hill, it costs about 24 pence per kilowatt hour. So over 3 times the cost, top of the hill to the bottom. Even if it's only a mile apart, the policy piece that gets lumped on top of that electricity. Now, I'll be the first to tell you it's not windy all the time, so we need a broader energy perspective, and that's where some of the work in hydrogen is particularly pertinent for filling in the gaps. But if we're making electricity for 7.5 pence and then trying to get developers of district heating schemes with large heat pumps to pay 24 pence for it, it won't work unless you ban gas, and I'm not an advocate of that, both in a larger sense and a smaller sense. So you've got to think of what makes people invest in projects, and it's stability. And what we want to see is that we can contract with a wind farm so that we can buy at 7.5 pence for the next 15 years. Because remember, they're selling the contracts for difference models a promise of 7.5 pence for every kilowatt hour, even to the extent, and this is a thing that we really need to get a hold of, is curtailment costs are now costing the UK economy about £1.5 billion per year. So that's the payments to switch wind farms off. And it's not because it's too windy or because the cables aren't big enough. It's because we've not created enough people that want more electricity when it's windy. And that's exactly what a heat pump does, because the windier it is, the draftier it is, and the chillier the buildings are. So if we find a mechanism of balancing this flexible demand for electricity with this flexible generation, we can actually counteract the variability of Mother Nature that brings varying wind outputs. If we can create a demand for electricity that's variable, we can stop paying £1.5 billion a year. And by the way, by 2030, that will be £5 billion. And the more wind farms you build without a balancing mechanism, the higher that number goes. And it's just running away with itself. And it's running away with itself because all people talk about is electricity.
Yeah, good point. And we've had a question about, it's from George Wands. It's a bit lengthy, but he's saying there's an outline for community-owned energy company model for Scotland. Are you guys familiar with that concept? It's under the Scotland Act, Community Empowerment Act, 2015.
Yeah. So I'll try and flick up the question, but in terms of community energy, we have representatives within Energy Scotland who are coming from the community energy sphere, and the irony is that a lot of that is devolved, and think we have powers that we can do more about that. One of the things Dave was talking about was some of the devolved powers. Ironically, heat is devolved to Scotland, whereas electricity isn't. Much I agree with what Dave says. I do notwithstanding, I think there's a big, great conversation to be had about electricity generation in this country, because I think we've got a massive potential for that. It's a great opportunity. You've some people maybe tuning into the Scottish government's work that they're doing, and I have to commend them on this, on the hydrogen export plan. They're really developing, looking at the fact Scotland blessed with this bountiful supply of renewable clean energy and this beautiful supply of clean water. What can you do with all that clean water and all of this electricity that is available at times? Well, I'll tell you, we can create hydrogen from it. Now, where the hydrogen is and getting that to where the customers are, there's a big discussion to be had on that. But that's one of the big discussions that's taking place in Energy Scotland at the moment. Good.
That sounds really interesting. I mean, everything you've been talking about tonight, both of you, is fantastically interesting. It slightly shocks me that I haven't come across much of this information. So it's commendable that Energy Scotland exists, because clearly there's a huge gap in the market in terms of communication. Now, I know you said earlier, John, that I think it was you, I think rather than Dave, that maybe you said this, Dave, that some of the media coverage was poor. I'm paraphrasing now, but my sense of it was you didn't have a high regard for some of the coverage that there is on energy matters. And I understand that. I mean, the first thing I ever learned about media was that you shouldn't look for terribly cerebral content unless you commit to it. You have to invest in it. Media is like everything. It's like energy. You have to invest in it, and you have policies that actually work. And the UK has a very poor communication system, and it's badly invested in. And the bit of investment that it does have is not necessarily aimed at the public good. But that's my little piece over. I just want to raise one small thing. You talked, Dave, about DRAX and the fuel source, and that fuel source coming from elsewhere. Anyone who studied supply chain concerns and problems, particularly those that occurred during COVID, will see that that whole environment will be replicated if there are tariffs. And if you rely upon a fuel source from elsewhere, then the likelihood is that the conveyancing means, either be containers or otherwise, and likely containers, all of that capacity will be taken up by Amazon and 2 or 3 other major players. And everyone else will go hang, because that's what happened in COVID, particularly in terms of shipment across the Pacific. So it's a very vulnerable situation to be in. Very quickly, because we've only got a few minutes left, wouldn't the answer be to all of this is to create some nuclear power stations like the government has in mind?
Oh my goodness! Okay, Dave, I'll give you a chance. I'll give you a kick of the cat.
Yeah, you could do. A, it would take a long time, and B, generally the wisdom is that they are pretty expensive. The notion that they are uptime, positive, doesn't quite hold true. I lean towards people. There's a professor at UCL called Mark Barrett, and actually, when you're looking at the capacity factor, which is the jargon, which means how many hours of the year do these things actually run, they're not actually getting that close to 100% as people think. So yes, you can have them and they're on all the time. The reality is that we do have some challenges to make that happen. And if it was investable, people would do it. That definitely would push up the price of electricity. The cheapest form of electricity at the moment that's being generated is solar, but it's a very short window of operation. It's about 1,200 hours per year, full load equivalent. It's really not very many hours. So it's 8,760 hours in a year. Wind capacity factors offshore are trending towards 60% output. So that's a really high number. And actually it's within striking distance of what nuclear does. But as I said earlier, I'll be the first to tell you it isn't windy all the time. What we need is a plan for when it's not. And that means flexible demand to match this flexible output.
Yeah. Okay, so you're going to hear the kind of debate that takes place within Energy Scotland. Nuclear is not a solution to intermittency. It is that I cannot believe that argument is allowed to go out there. At the moment, nuclear plants will not be available. New nukes would not be available this side of the 2030s. End of chat. It's not happening, right? And so what do we do for intermittency at the moment? We switch on gas turbines, right? And they're going to be with us right through into the 2030s. Right? And they're very fast acting, and they come on, and they've been running for 25 years, and they've been well maintained, and that's what's going to happen. So this thing, we need to invest in nukes to deal with the intermittency of renewables. It's like I can't believe that argument's allowed to hold.
Come on, John, you must understand the way these things work.
Well, no, I don't.
You must have noticed that. I mean, the old chestnuts crop up every single time there's a change of government.
Oh, that's true.
It's not just nukes; it's a third runway at Heathrow. I mean, I've lived for too long to listen to the same nonsense being talked every successive government.
Hinkley C was meant to be delivering, as the guy, famous CEO famously said of EDF. He said, "You'll be cooking your Christmas dinner from energy from Hinkley C in 2017 Christmas." Right, here we are, 2025. It's not going to be ready this side of the 2030, in my opinion. Just looking at the construction progress they're making, right? Because they haven't even spoken about the commissioning problems on that. Yeah. And then Sizewell C, which is going to be £45 billion, right? £45 billion for 3.2 gigawatt of energy. Now, that's 45 with 9 zeros at the end of it, guys. They recently upgraded. They did a maintenance work in Torness recently, and it cost 75 billion. You could do that 600 times before you get to the cost of a new nuke down in Sizewell. So, there's so much. I'll give you a pass. The journalistic community, I'll give them a pass. They're getting a lot better, John. That's all I'm going to say.
Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. It's been a very interesting conversation. We aim to inform, educate, and entertain. And you guys have done that for us tonight very ably indeed.
Thank you, John.
Much appreciated,
you, John.
And I did say that hour would go quickly. It has, frankly. We've got more questions that we could have used, and maybe maybe later on in the year, you might consider coming back either singly or together. And we'll try and cover more of what we really needed to have covered tonight, but we just ran out of time. Thank you again. Much appreciated. And let me just tell you, everyone, that next week we've got another great guest, and we'll be talking to Byline Scotland. So if you've got issues about communication, etc., then come and listen to Martin Roche. Thank you again, gentlemen. Much appreciated. Take care. Good night. Stay safe, everyone. Look after each other. Good night.